I moved into the house at the edge of town to escape. Escape from the noise, crowded streets, and most of all, the memories. The city, with its constant hum of life, become unbearable. A suffocating reminder of everything I had lost. Every corner, every familiar sight brought back flashes of her. A laugh, touch, a life that had been mine but was now nothing more than a cruel illusion. The small town, nestled between the dense woods and a winding river, seemed like the perfect place to start anew. Or maybe to forget. The house had stood empty for years, the realtor told me, and I could see why. It was a sagging relic of another time. Its paint chipped and faded, its windows cloudy with dust. Floors creaked underfoot as if groaning from the weight of its past, and the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the weather, almost alive. But that suited me just fine. I didn't want new, or shiny, or bright. I wanted solitude. A place where I could be alone with my thoughts, where I could finally make sense of the chaos that had become my life. So I signed the papers and moved in, bringing with me little more than a suitcase of clothes and the few belongings I hadn't been able to part with after the accident. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. Town was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the occasional car passing by or the distant bark of a dog to break the silence. My nearest neighbor was an elderly man who lived a few houses down, but I had yet to see him. The other homes on the street were similarly worn and weathered, their owners seemingly content to remain as isolated as I was. I told myself I had made the right choice. This was what I needed. Place to heal. But as the days turned into nights, the stillness that had once been comforting began to weigh on me, pressing in on all sides. It was in that oppressive silence that I first noticed the knocking. It started about a week after I moved in. I had just settled into bed, the old mattress groaning under my weight, when I heard it. A single sharp knock on the front door. It was loud enough to make me sit up, my heart suddenly racing. I listened, holding my breath, waiting for it to come again, but the house remained silent. I dismissed it as a trick of the wind, or maybe the old pipes. After all, the house had been empty for years. I was still getting used to its quirks. But the next night, at exactly the same time, the knock came again. This time, I was ready. I threw off the covers and rushed to the door, flipping on the porch light as I yanked it open. There was no one there. The night was cool, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. I stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the empty street, the shadowed outlines of the trees, and the faint glow of the moon behind a veil of clouds. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirp of crickets. With a shiver, I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me. For the next few nights, the knocking continued, always at midnight, always just one sharp rap on the door. I stopped rushing to answer it, knowing what I would find, or rather, what I wouldn't find. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound reverberating in my mind long after it had faded. By the end of the first week, I had convinced myself it was just a prank. Maybe some local kids had discovered the new guy in town and decided to have a little fun at my expense. It was annoying, but hardly worth losing sleep over. I resolved to ignore it, figuring they would eventually get bored and move on. But then, things started to change. It was subtle at first. A chair moved slightly out of place, a book that I was sure I had left on the coffee table now lying on the floor. I told myself I was just being forgetful, that the stress of the move was playing tricks on my mind. But as the days passed, the disturbances grew more frequent, more deliberate. One morning, I awoke to find the kitchen cabinet doors wide open, every single one of them. Another day, I came home from a walk to find the old grandfather clock in the living room had stopped at precisely midnight, its pendulum still and silent. I hadn't even realized it was working. Then there was the note. I found it one morning, lying on the kitchen table where I always sat to drink my coffee. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed, as if it had been there for years. But I knew it hadn't been there the night before. The handwriting was what stopped me cold, delicate, looping letters, written in a hand I knew all too well. I stared at the note for a long time, my mind reeling. It couldn't be her. Wasn't possible. She was gone, had been gone for months. But the handwriting, it was identical, down to the way she curled the L and crossed the T. Cold dread settled in my stomach as I picked up the note, my fingers trembling. I read it again and again, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how many times I looked at it, the words remained the same, the message unmistakable. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, the note clutched in my hand, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the knock that I knew would come. And it did, right on schedule, a single sharp rap that echoed through the silent house. But this time, I didn't move. I didn't rush to the door, didn't flip on the light. I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Something was wrong with this house. Something that went beyond creaking floors and faulty pipes. Something that was growing stronger, more malevolent, with each passing night. And as I sat there, the note crumpled in my fist, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was just getting started. The note weighed heavily on my mind, a constant presence that I couldn't shake. I kept it folded in my pocket, its crinkled edges worn from my constant handling. I would pull it out at odd moments, staring at the familiar handwriting, trying to decipher some hidden meaning that might explain its existence. But there was no explanation, no logical reason why a note in my dead wife's handwriting would appear on my kitchen table, warning me to leave a place I had just begun to call home. As the days passed, the house grew colder, more oppressive. The disturbances continued, each one a little more unsettling than the last. Doors that I had closed would be open when I returned. Lights that I had turned off would flicker back to life. And that incessant knocking, always at midnight, always a single echoing rap on the door, never ceased. I stopped answering it altogether. There was no point. Whoever, or whatever, was knocking wasn't interested in a face-to-face meeting. It just wanted to remind me that it was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for something. Sleep became an elusive comfort, slipping through my fingers the moment I closed my eyes. I took to wandering the house at all hours of the night, searching for some sign of an intruder, some clue that might explain the madness that had taken over my life. But the house remained stubbornly silent, its secrets locked away behind walls that had witnessed too much. One evening, as I sat in the living room nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, the grandfather clock struck midnight. The chime was hollow, reverberating through the house like a funeral bell. I had come to dread that sound, knowing what would follow, the knock, the reminder that I was not alone. But that night, something was different. The chime faded into silence, and I waited, breath held, for the familiar rap on the door. But it never came. Instead, there was a soft, shuffling noise from upstairs, like footsteps moving across the floor. I froze, every muscle tensing as I listened. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth in the room directly above me, my bedroom. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. The house was silent again, but the silence felt different now. Charged, almost expectant, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the table and began to ascend the stairs, each step an effort of will. The air grew colder the higher I climbed. Chill that seeped into my bones and made my breath fog in the darkness. When I reached the landing, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the bedroom door. Creaked open with a groan, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. The curtains fluttered in a breeze that shouldn't have been there, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. Except for the bed. The covers were pulled back as if someone had just climbed out of it, and there, on the pillow, lay another note. The same yellowed paper, the same looping handwriting. "You should have left." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. How had it gotten here? Who could have written it? But the answers eluded me, slipping away like shadows in the dark. Suddenly, the door to the adjoining bathroom creaked open, and I whirled around, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The bathroom was empty, but the door swung slowly on its hinges as if nudged by an unseen hand. I backed out of the room. I needed to get out, to leave this house, this place that was quickly becoming a prison of fear. But where would I go? back to the city, to the memories I had tried so hard to escape. The thought was almost as unbearable as staying. As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, I felt a cold draft at my back, as if someone had just walked past me. I spun around, but there was no one there, only the open door to the bedroom, swinging slightly as if recently disturbed. I couldn't stay here. Not tonight. I grabbed my coat and keys and fled the house. Cool night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to be away from there, from the suffocating presence that seemed to be tightening its grip on my sanity. I drove through the empty streets, the town a ghostly blur outside the car windows. The roads were deserted, the houses dark and silent, their occupants hidden away from the horrors that stalked the night. Eventually, I found myself parked outside a small diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of truckers hunched over their coffee at the counter. I slid into a booth at the back, my hands still trembling as I ordered a cup of coffee, anything to warm the cold that had settled deep in my bones. As I sat there, staring into the steaming mug, my mind raced with questions, each more terrifying than the last. What was happening in that house? Was it all in my head? Some twisted manifestation of my grief and guilt? Or was there something darker? Something far beyond my understanding? The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, came over and refilled my cup. She must have noticed the haunted look in my eyes because she paused, her expression softening. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You could say that," I muttered, not meeting her gaze. She hesitated, then slid into the booth across from me, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied me. "You're new in town, right? Moved into that old house on the edge of town?" I nodded, too tired to question how she knew. She sighed, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening before leaning in closer. "That place has a history, you know. People say it's haunted." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Haunted? By what?" She shrugged, but there was fear in her eyes. "Different people say different things. Some say it's the spirit of the man who lived there before. Others say it's something worse. All I know is that no one who's lived there has ever stayed long." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words died on my lips. What could I say? That I was being haunted by the ghost of my dead wife? That strange notes were appearing in her handwriting, warning me to leave? Sounded insane, even to me. The waitress seemed to sense my hesitation and stood up, giving me a sympathetic look. "Whatever it is, you should be careful. Sometimes it's better not to stick around to find out." I watched her walk away, her words echoing in my mind. Was that what I needed to do? Leave, before whatever was in that house drove me mad, like it had the others? But where would I go? And more importantly, what was keeping me there, despite the terror that gripped me every night? I left the diner as dawn was breaking, the first light of morning chasing away the shadows that had haunted me throughout the night. As I drove back to the house, part of me hoped that the daylight would bring some sense of clarity, that I would wake up from this nightmare and find everything back to normal. But when I pulled into the driveway and saw the house standing there, dark and silent, I knew that nothing was normal, and that whatever had started with a simple knock on the door was far from over. The sun hung low in the sky as I returned to the house, its dim light casting long shadows that stretched across the yard like dark fingers clawing their way toward the old structure. I sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the house, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of fear and curiosity. The waitress's words haunted me. Haunted, that word now seemed more fitting than ever. There was something about this place, something malevolent that seemed to lurk just beyond the edge of perception. And I had to know what it was. I wasn't going to sleep, not after the night I had. So instead of retreating back to my room, or worse, that cursed bedroom, I made a decision. I was going to find out more about this house, about its history and the people who had lived here before me. Maybe, just maybe, I could find some explanation for the madness that was slowly consuming me. I knew of only one person who might be able to help. The old man who lived down the street had been a fixture in the neighborhood for decades, according to the realtor who sold me the house. He was something of a recluse, rarely seen outside his home, but I had noticed him a few times, shuffling down the street with a cane, eyes clouded with age. If anyone knew the history of the house, it would be him. I left the car and walked the short distance to his home, gravel crunching under my shoes, the only sound in the still morning air. His house was as old and weathered as mine, though better maintained. Front yard was overgrown, grass tall and wild, but the windows were clean and the roof looked solid. I hesitated at the front door, my hand raised to knock, before finally gathering the courage to rap on the wood. The sound echoed hollowly, and I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the shuffling of feet, and the door creaked open, revealing the old man. He was shorter than I remembered, hunched over with age, his face a map of wrinkles. His eyes, however, were sharp, despite their clouded appearance, and they fixed on me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Yes? His voice was raspy, as if unused to speaking. "Good morning, sir," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Ethan Clarke. I moved into the house down the street, and I was hoping you might have some time to talk." His gaze flicked toward my house, his expression tightening. "You're living in the old Mason place, then?" "Yes," I said, surprised he knew the name. "I was hoping you could tell me more about it. I've been having some strange experiences there, and I think it might be connected to the history of the house." For a long moment, didn't speak, his eyes boring into mine as if searching for something. Finally, he sighed and opened the door wider, motioning for me to come inside. The interior of his home was as old-fashioned as the exterior, filled with worn furniture and faded photographs in tarnished frames. The air smelled of dust and old wood, with a faint undertone of something herbal, perhaps a lingering scent of tea or medicinal ointment. He led me to a small sitting room and gestured for me to take a seat in one of the threadbare armchairs. "Not many people ask about the Mason place," he said, settling into a chair across from me. "Most who live there don't stay long enough to wonder." I felt a chill at his words, but I forced myself to focus. "What happened there? Why is the house like it is?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to a point somewhere above my head, as if looking into the past. "The Mason family moved into that house about 30 years ago. Edward Mason, his wife Lillian, and their 2 young children. They were a quiet family, kept to themselves mostly, but by all accounts, they were happy." He paused, a deep sadness coloring his voice. But that happiness didn't last. Not long after they moved in, strange things started happening. Lillian would tell neighbors about the noises, footsteps in the night, whispers coming from empty rooms. She found objects moved from where she'd left them, just like you've experienced. I nodded, my throat tightening as I realized how similar their experiences were to mine. Edward dismissed it at first. The old man continued. He was a practical man. But as the months went by, the disturbances grew worse. They found messages scrawled on the walls, written in what looked like blood. Children began to have terrible nightmares, waking up screaming in the night, claiming they'd seen a dark figure standing at the foot of their beds. He shook his head slowly, his voice growing quieter. And then one day, Lillian was found dead in the attic. They said she had hanged herself. There were bruises on her neck that suggested something else had a hand in it. Edward, he lost his mind after that. Took the children and fled the house, leaving everything behind. He was never seen again. A heavy silence filled the room as the old man's words sank in. My mind raced, trying to process what he had told me. It was like my own experiences were an eerie echo of the Mason families. Only now, I was living their nightmare. "What about the messages?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The ones written on the walls, did they ever find out who or what wrote them?" The old man shook his head. "No one knows. The house was abandoned after the Masons left, and it stayed that way for years. Town tried to sell it a few times, but no one wanted it. Eventually it was forgotten, left to rot, until you came along." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Do you think it's possible that whatever haunted the Masons is still there? In the house?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or sorrow. "It's not just possible," he said quietly. "It's certain. The house has a darkness in it, something that feeds on fear and despair. It destroyed the Masons, and it will destroy you too if you let it." I sat there, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to call him a superstitious old man, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had felt that darkness creeping into my thoughts, into my dreams, and it was getting stronger. "What can I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I get rid of it?" The old man sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Some things can't be gotten rid of, son. Some things are just there waiting. You can try to fight it, but that's a battle you're not likely to win. My advice? Leave. Leave while you still can." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Leave? I had moved here to escape the memories of my wife, find some peace in the quiet solitude of the countryside. But now it seemed I had traded one kind of torment for another. But could I really just walk away? What would that mean? Admitting defeat? Abandoning the house, just as the Masons had? And where would I go? Back to the city, back to the life I had tried so hard to leave behind. I stood up, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. "Thank you for telling me this," I said, my voice hollow. "I need to think." The old man nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes as he looked up at me. "You're not the first to try to fight it," he said softly, "but sometimes the best thing you can do is know when to walk away." I left his house feeling more lost than ever, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. As I walked back to my own home, the sun had fully risen, casting a weak, pale light over the town. But even in the daylight, the house seemed to loom larger, darker, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in that house, whatever had driven the Masons to despair, it wasn't finished yet. It was still there, waiting, watching. I spent the rest of the day pacing through the house, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind putting my nerves on edge. The old man's words played on a loop in my mind, each one pushing me closer to the edge of panic. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that leaving was the only sensible option. But every time I considered packing my bags and driving away, something held me back. A gnawing need to understand, to confront whatever darkness had taken hold of my life. As evening fell, the shadows deepened, stretching across the walls like skeletal fingers. I kept the lights on in every room, but the house still felt dark, oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time night fell, I was too exhausted to continue pacing. My body ached, and my head throbbed with the pressure of unanswered questions. I decided to try and sleep, only to escape the relentless tension gnawing at my mind. I left the hallway light on as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the soft glow spilling into the room and casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I hesitated at the doorway, my eyes drawn to the bed where I had found the second note. The sheets had been washed and remade, but I could still feel the icy presence that had seeped into the room that night. With a shiver, I moved to the bathroom, hoping that splashing cold water on my face might help clear my head. The bathroom was small, with an old-fashioned clawfoot tub and a porcelain sink stained with age. A large mirror hung over the sink, surface clouded with streaks and spots of corrosion. I turned on the tap, the pipes groaning as water sputtered out and splashed my face with the icy liquid. The shock of the cold water jolted me awake, if only for a moment. As I reached for a towel, I glanced up at the mirror and froze. There in the reflection was a figure standing just behind me, a shadow, tall and indistinct, looming in the doorway of the bathroom. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. I spun around, expecting to confront the intruder, but the doorway was empty. I turned back to the mirror, my hands trembling as I stared into the glass. The shadow was gone. My reflection looked wrong, distorted somehow, as if the mirror itself was bending the light in unnatural ways. My face seemed pale, almost sickly, in my eyes. They weren't quite my own. The pupils were dilated, black holes that seemed to stretch into infinity, and the expression was one of fear, but also something darker, more sinister. I backed away from the sink, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could feel the walls of the bathroom closing in around me, the air growing thick and cold. The light flickered, and for a moment, the reflection in the mirror smiled, a twisted, mocking grin that didn't belong to me. I bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me, as if that could somehow trap whatever horror lurked in that reflection. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as I stumbled back into the bedroom. I didn't dare look at the mirror again. Couldn't bear to see whatever was hiding behind that glass. But even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the bathroom, that it was lurking in the shadows of the room, waiting for me to let my guard down. I felt it in every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, and most of all, in the cold spot that seemed to have settled at the foot of my bed. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Instead, I sat in the corner of the room, my back pressed against the wall, staring into the darkness and listening to the sounds of the house. The knocking came, as it always did, a single, sharp rap on the front door at the stroke of midnight. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I was too afraid of what might happen if I did. The hours dragged on, the darkness never seeming to lift, even as the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains. When the sun finally rose, I felt no relief, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that left me hollow and numb. I couldn't go on like this. I knew that much. The house was driving me mad, just as it had driven the Masons mad all those years ago. Leaving? That seemed impossible now. It was as if the house itself wouldn't let me go, its malevolent presence tightening its grip on my mind with each passing day. Desperate for answers, I decided to return to the one place where I might find them, the attic. It was the one part of the house I had avoided, place where Lillian Mason had met her end. The thought of what I might find up there filled me with dread, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something important, was hidden in those dusty rafters. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made my way to the attic door, which was located at the end of the hallway on the second floor. The door was old, the wood splintered and warped with age. The handle was ice cold to the touch, and it took all my strength to turn it, the hinges groaning in protest as I pushed the door open. A narrow staircase led up into the darkness, the steps creaking under my weight as I ascended. The air grew colder with each step, the musty scent of old wood and dust filling my nostrils. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the low, slanted ceiling of the attic and the cobwebs that hung like shrouds from the rafters. The attic was small, cramped, filled with old, forgotten things, an antique dresser covered in dust, a broken rocking chair, and boxes upon boxes of belongings that had been left behind. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for any sign of what had happened here all those years ago. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden beneath an old sheet, was a large, ornate mirror. Glass was cracked, spiderweb fractures running across its surface, and the frame was carved with intricate designs that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the mirror, the air around me growing colder with each step. The beam of the flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. When I reached the mirror, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the glass. It was cold, colder than the air around me, and as my fingers brushed against the surface, a jolt of electricity shot through me, freezing me in place. For a moment, the reflection in the mirror was just that, my own face, pale and drawn, staring back at me. But then, the cracks in the glass seemed to shift, the lines twisting and curling like veins, and the reflection began to change. It was subtle at first, flicker, a distortion, but as I watched, my reflection twisted, warping into something else, something darker. The eyes in the mirror weren't mine anymore. They were hollow, empty, filled with a malevolent darkness that seemed to reach out and wrap itself around my soul. Then the reflection smiled. Wasn't my smile. It was a grin, wide and cruel, stretching too far, the lips cracking and bleeding as the corners of the mouth pulled back to reveal teeth that were sharp and jagged. The thing in the mirror wasn't me. It was something else. Something that had been waiting, lurking just beneath the surface. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the image in the mirror didn't fade. It grew stronger, more defined, as if the darkness within was feeding on my fear. Reflection reached out, hand pressing against the glass, and for a moment, I thought it was going to break through. to pull me into that twisted, nightmarish world on the other side. But then the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched scream that echoed through the attic, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. I threw up my hands to shield my face, feeling the sting of glass cutting into my skin. Cold, malevolent presence in the room seemed to dissipate, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of its existence. When I finally lowered my arms, the mirror was gone, reduced to a pile of broken glass and splintered wood. The reflection was gone too, nothing but shattered fragments of an impossible image. I stood there, breathing heavily, cold air burning my lungs. The attic was silent now, the darkness no longer pressing in on me, but the terror remained, lodged deep within me like a splinter that I couldn't remove. I had come looking for answers. All I had found was more fear. The mirror had shown me something that was buried deep within the house, or maybe deep within me. But what it meant, I couldn't say. All I knew was that the house was no longer just a place of refuge. It was a prison, one that I wasn't sure I would ever escape. And as I made my way back down the stairs, leaving the shattered remnants of the mirror behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that reflection was still watching me, still waiting for the right moment to reach out from the darkness and pull me under. The next few days passed in a haze of unease and exhaustion. The shattered mirror in the attic had left me with more questions than answers, and the house seemed to close in on me with each passing hour. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights sent shivers down my spine. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, as if something terrible was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, even going for long walks through the town. But no matter where I went or what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the darkness I had glimpsed in the mirror was following me, inching closer with each passing moment. Sleep became an impossible luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by visions of that twisted reflection, its cruel grin etched into my mind like a brand. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, walls whispering secrets in the dead of night, filling my dreams with horrors I couldn't escape. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a familiar knock came, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the silence like a gunshot. But this time, something was different. The knock wasn't at the front door. It was coming from inside the house. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound echoed again, louder this time, as if something or someone was moving through the hallways, knocking on the walls as it passed. I held my breath, listening as the knocks grew closer, each one sending a jolt of fear through my body. The knocking stopped just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the door, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for the handle to turn, for the door to swing open and reveal whatever horror was waiting on the other side. But the door remained closed, the silence thick and oppressive. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it filled the room, wrapping around me like a cold, clammy hand. Come. The word was drawn out, a ghostly invitation that sent chills down my spine. I didn't want to move, didn't want to answer, but something compelled me to swing my legs out of bed, my body moving of its own accord. My feet touched the cold floor, and I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest as I slowly made my way to the door. The voice was closer now, more insistent, tugging at the edges of my mind. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, to get as far away from that voice as possible. But I couldn't. Something had taken hold of me, some dark force that I couldn't resist. I turned the doorknob and opened the door. The hallway beyond was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. Air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the house seemed to hum with a low, almost inaudible vibration, the pulse of some unseen creature. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and the door clicked shut behind me. The voice called to me again, pulling me forward, leading me deeper into the house. I followed, unable to resist, my mind foggy and disconnected, as if I were moving through a dream. Voice led me down the stairs, house creaking and groaning as I passed, the shadows seeming to shift and twist in the corners of my vision. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with a jumbled cacophony of words I couldn't understand. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the living room. The door to the basement was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. The voice was coming from down there, echoing up from the depths, a haunting, disembodied sound that sent waves of terror through me. I hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, the darkness below seeming to stretch out infinitely, a void that threatened to swallow me whole. I could feel the cold air rising from below, a damp, musty chill that made my skin crawl. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, flee the house and never return. But the voice wouldn't let me go. It tugged at me, pulling me forward, whispering promises and threats that I couldn't fully comprehend. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear that gripped my heart, and stepped down into the darkness. Stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The basement was pitch black. Flashlight I had brought with me, barely cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness. The air was damp and stale, filled with the scent of mold and decay, and the walls seemed to close in around me as I descended. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I froze, my heart racing, cold, damp air pressing in on me from all sides. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then the voice returned, louder now, more distinct. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural chant, a language I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a primal terror. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls, reverberating through my skull. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to get it to work. But it was useless. The light remained dead, leaving me blind in the darkness. Panic surged through me, and I turned to go back up the stairs, to escape the basement and the voice that was now pounding in my head like a drum. Something was blocking the stairs. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, an immense, cold presence standing between me and the way out. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, as if urging me to turn back, to descend deeper into the basement, into the black abyss that awaited below. I was trapped, cornered by something I couldn't see, couldn't fight. The air grew colder still, my breath coming out in visible puffs as the temperature plummeted. The darkness around me seemed to press in, suffocating me, crushing the air from my lungs. And then the voice changed. It became softer, more familiar, and I recognized it instantly. It was her voice, my wife's voice. "Ethan?" The sound of her voice broke something inside me, and I staggered back, tears springing to my eyes. The fear that had gripped me just moments before was suddenly replaced with an overwhelming sense of longing, of despair. "Ethan, come to me." The voice was coming from the far corner of the basement, from the deepest, darkest part of the room. My heart ached at the sound, at the memory of her, of everything we had lost. I couldn't resist it. I couldn't ignore the call of the woman I had loved more than anything in the world. I moved toward the voice, my steps slow and hesitant, my hands outstretched in the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the chill seeping into my bones, but I didn't care. All I could think about was her, about the possibility, impossible as it seemed, that she was somehow here, waiting for me. The voice guided me, pulling me deeper into the darkness until I felt the cold, rough surface of the basement wall beneath my fingers. And then I felt something else. A door, hidden in the shadows, its wood damp and warped with age. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into a small, narrow room. The air inside was frigid, almost unbearably cold, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with old, dusty books and strange, unidentifiable objects. In the center of the room was a small, round table, and on it lay a single object, a photograph. I approached the table, my heart pounding in my chest, and picked up the photograph. It was old, the edges frayed, the image faded with time, but I recognized it instantly. It was a picture of me and my wife, taken on our wedding day. We were smiling, her head resting on my shoulder, her eyes bright with happiness. Tears blurred my vision as I stared at the photograph, my hands trembling. The memories flooded back. Our life together, the love we had shared, future we had planned, and then the accident. The moment everything had changed, when she had been taken from me, leaving me alone in a world that suddenly felt cold and empty. The photographs slipped from my fingers, landing on the table with a soft thud. I sank to my knees, the weight of my grief too much to bear. The voice continued to whisper to me, soft and soothing, promising me that I could be with her again, that we could be together, if only I would listen. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness consume me, letting her voice wash over me. I wanted to believe it, wanted to give in to the promise of seeing her again. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong. This wasn't real. The air grew colder still, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the presence of something behind me, something immense and powerful, waiting for me to make a choice. And then I heard it. The faintest sound, barely audible over the whispering voice. It was a heartbeat, slow and steady, coming from deep within the house, pulsing in time with the darkness that surrounded me. I opened my eyes, the spell of the voice broken, and stumbled back to my feet. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in, air growing thick and heavy. I had to get out. I had to leave this house before it consumed me, or it took everything I had left. I turned and ran, the darkness chasing me as I fled the basement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was back in my bedroom. The door locked behind me, my back pressed against the wall as I struggled to catch my breath. The house was silent again, the whispers gone, but the cold, oppressive presence remained. Constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I knew now that whatever was haunting this house wasn't just a ghost. It was something darker, something that fed on fear and despair, something that wanted me. And as I sat there in the darkness, trembling with fear, I realized that leaving might not be enough. Whatever this thing was, it had already sunk its claws into me, and it wasn't going to let go. The only question was how long I could hold on before it finally dragged me under. I spent the next day in a daze, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like a broken record. My thoughts were muddled, as if a thick fog had settled over my consciousness, making it hard to focus on anything other than the persistent dread that gnawed at my inside. The house felt more oppressive than ever, its walls closing in, its shadows lengthening with every passing hour. I tried to occupy myself with simple tasks, making breakfast, tidying up the living room, even attempting to read a book. Nothing could distract me from the growing sense of unease that clung to me like a second skin. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart leap into my throat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the twisted reflection from the mirror standing behind me, grinning that awful, unnatural smile. By afternoon, I could no longer stand the silence. I grabbed my jacket and fled the house, needing to feel the sun on my skin, to breathe air that didn't taste like dust and decay. The town was quiet, as it always was, its streets nearly deserted, save for the occasional car or passerby. I walked without a destination in mind, my feet carrying me along the winding roads and narrow lanes that crisscrossed the town. The houses I passed were all old, their facades worn and weathered by time, but none of them exuded the same malevolent presence as mine. I felt a pang of envy for the people who lived in those houses, for their blissful ignorance of the darkness that had taken root in mine. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of the town, where the paved roads gave way to dirt paths that led into the dense woods. Trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. There was something almost comforting about the woods, the way the thick canopy blocked out the sun, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. It was a place untouched by the passage of time, where the weight of the modern world seemed to lift, if only for a moment. I followed one of the paths into the woods, letting the sounds of nature surround me. The rustle of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the soft crunch of twigs beneath my boots. The deeper I went, the more the tension in my chest began to ease, the oppressive weight of the house fading into the background. The relief was short-lived. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the path became less defined, the undergrowth thicker, the trees more gnarled and twisted. The air grew colder, shadows darker, and I began to feel the same sense of unease that had plagued me in the house. It was as if the darkness that had taken root there was reaching out, extending its influence into the forest, wrapping me in its icy grip. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. The woods were silent now, the sounds of nature gone, replaced by a heavy, expectant hush. I looked around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees, their trunks thick and ancient, their branches intertwining overhead. And then I heard it. Faintest whisper, carried on the wind just like the night before. Ethan. My blood ran cold. It was the same voice, her voice, calling to me from somewhere deeper in the woods. It was impossible, I knew that, but the sound of her voice sent a surge of emotions through me. Grief, longing, and something darker, something that felt like a pull, a compulsion to follow. I took a step forward, then another, a voice growing louder with each step I took. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around and run. My body refused to listen. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path narrowing until it was nothing more than a thin strip of dirt winding through the underbrush. Ethan, come to me. The voice was clearer now, more insistent, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from somewhere ahead of me. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed through the thick undergrowth, the branches scratching at my arms, the leaves crunching underfoot. The path ended abruptly at a small clearing, ground covered in moss and fallen leaves. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient tree, its bark dark and knotted, its roots twisted and gnarled, stretching out across the ground like the fingers of some immense buried creature. I approached the tree, my steps slow and hesitant, my eyes fixed on its rough, weathered surface. There was something strange about it, something that set it apart from the other trees in the forest. The air around it was colder, the shadows darker, and as I drew closer, I noticed something carved into the bark, an intricate pattern of symbols and lines, their meaning lost to time. My fingers brushed against the carvings, and I felt a jolt, like an electric shock, course through me. The world seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath my feet, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But then the sensation passed, leaving me with a sense of disorientation, as if I had stepped into another world, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. Ethan. The voice was right behind me now, so close I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I spun around expecting to see her standing there, but there was no one, only the dense wall of trees surrounding the clearing. And then I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. It was a woman, her form indistinct, her face obscured by the darkness. But I knew it was her. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my heart ached at the sight of her. Lillian? I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me, presence both comforting and terrifying. I took a step toward her, my hand outstretched, but as I did, the ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The world around me began to blur, the edges of my vision darkening, and I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity that I wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. The moss-covered earth beneath me had turned soft, like wet clay, and I could feel myself sinking, the ground pulling me down into its cold, suffocating embrace. I tried to pull myself free, but the harder I struggled, the deeper I sank. The earth seemed to close in around me, the roots of the ancient tree wrapping around my legs, my torso, dragging me down into the darkness. I could hear the voice again, calling to me, urging me to let go, to give in. Ethan, come to me. My vision dimmed, the world around me dissolving into shadows, and I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my wrist. I looked up, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and saw her face, Lillian's face, emerging from the darkness, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into that same cruel grin I had seen in the mirror. And then, with one final desperate effort, pulled myself free, the roots tearing at my skin as I scrambled back, away from the tree, away from the darkness that had nearly consumed me. I staggered to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, and turned to run, not daring to look back, not daring to acknowledge the whispers that still echoed in my mind. I don't know how long I ran, how far I fled into the depths of the forest, but when I finally stopped, I was alone, the trees standing silent and tall around me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The voice was gone. The presence that had haunted me in the clearing, nothing more than a distant memory. But the fear, the terror, remained lodged deep in my chest. I collapsed against the trunk of a tree, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing. I had to get out of these woods, had to get away from that tree, from the darkness that had nearly swallowed me whole. But as I struggled to regain my bearings, find my way back to town, I realized with a sickening sense of dread that I was lost, trapped in a labyrinth of ancient trees and winding paths that seemed to twist and shift with each step I took. And then, as the last light of day began to fade, plunging the forest into twilight, I heard it again, faintest whisper, buried on the wind, beckoning me back into the darkness. I knew then that I was trapped, that no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I fought, the darkness would find me, would drag me back into its cold, suffocating embrace. And as I stood there, lost and alone in the heart of the forest, I realized that the house, the darkness, had followed me here, that it was a part of me now, inextricably linked to my very soul. There was no escape. The forest closed in around me as night fell, the last vestiges of sunlight disappearing behind the thick canopy of trees. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive, and I felt as though the very woods themselves were conspiring to keep me trapped, leading me deeper into the labyrinth of shadows and twisted roots. My footsteps were the only sound in the silence, a rhythmic crunch of leaves and twigs that seemed almost deafening in the stillness. I wandered through the forest, aimless and lost, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The events of the last few days had shattered my understanding of reality, leaving me with only fragments of what was once my life. Lillian's voice, the reflection in the mirror, the house, it was all too much. My grip on sanity felt tenuous at best, as if one more whisper from the darkness would send me spiraling into madness. But the woods offered no solace, no comfort. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to twist and contort, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, snagging on my clothes, pulling at my hair. The path underfoot was uneven, treacherous, and more than once I stumbled, barely catching myself before tumbling to the ground. My only source of light was the faint, intermittent glow of the moon filtering through the dense foliage. It cast strange, shifting shadows on the forest floor, making every rock and root seem like a lurking threat. I tried to stay focused, to keep moving, but the oppressive darkness was relentless, pressing in on all sides. At some point, I found myself standing in another clearing, smaller than the first, surrounded by a circle of ancient trees. The moonlight spilled into the open space, illuminating the twisted, knotted roots that snaked across the ground. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, its surface covered in strange, intricate carvings, similar to those I had seen on the tree in the previous clearing. I approached the stone cautiously, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air around it was heavy, thick, with an energy that felt almost tangible, like a low, vibrating hum that I could feel in my bones. As I drew closer, the carvings seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive, moving beneath the surface of the stone. I knelt beside the stone, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed against the cold, rough surface, a shock of energy jolted through me, and the world seemed to tilt, ground swaying beneath me. I gasped, pulling my hand back, but the sensation lingered, leaving me lightheaded and disoriented. And then, from the shadows of the trees, I saw it, figure dark and indistinct, emerging from the edge of the clearing. It was taller than any human, its limbs elongated and twisted, its face obscured by a darkness that seemed to radiate from within. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world, and I realized with a cold, sinking dread that it was coming for me. I scrambled back, away from the stone, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence in my mind, an invasive, cold touch that sent waves of terror through me. The darkness seemed to cling to it, a shadow that moved independently, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. Desperation clawed at me, and I turned to flee, but the figure was faster, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. In a blink, it was upon me, its cold, shadowy hands wrapping around my arms, holding me in place. I struggled, but my strength was nothing against the icy grip that pinned me down. The figure leaned closer, its face mere inches from mine, and I saw its eyes, dark, empty voids that seemed to stretch into infinity, filled with the same malevolent energy that had haunted the house. The same twisted smile from the mirror crept across its face, and I realized with a sickening jolt that this was the same entity, the same darkness that had been tormenting me since I moved into the house. But it wasn't finished. The darkness that clung to the figure began to seep into my skin, an icy, paralyzing force that drained the warmth from my body, leaving me numb and weak. I could feel it working its way into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, pushing its way into the deepest corners of my soul. And then I heard her voice, Lillian's voice, soft and distant, calling to me from somewhere far away. The sound of her voice, pure and untainted by the darkness, gave me a sliver of strength, a lifeline to cling to in the overwhelming tide of fear. I fought against the darkness, against the cold tendrils that were trying to drag me down, using every ounce of willpower I had left. "Lillian," I cried out, my voice barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. The figure hesitated, its grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I stumbled backward, away from the shadowy entity, gasping for breath as the cold receded. But the darkness wasn't done with me yet. The figure surged forward, its form dissolving into a mass of shadows that swirled around me, wrapping me in a suffocating embrace. The air grew colder, the shadows pressing in on all sides, and I could feel myself being pulled under, the world fading into blackness. And then, just as the darkness was about to consume me, a brilliant flash of light erupted from the stone in the center of the clearing, illuminating the entire area in a blinding white glow. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing as they were driven back by the light. I fell to my knees, shielding my eyes from the intense brightness. But the light wasn't painful. It was warm, comforting, like the first rays of dawn after a long, cold night. When the light finally faded, the shadows were gone, and the clearing was silent once more. The figure had vanished, leaving no trace behind, and I was alone, kneeling beside the stone, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. I didn't know what had just happened, didn't understand the significance of the stone or the light, but I knew one thing for certain: the darkness had been driven back, at least for now. I was still alive, still in control of my own mind, and that was enough. As I struggled to my feet, I realized that the carvings on the stone had changed. They were no longer shifting and writhing. They were stable, solid, and I could make out a pattern, a design that seemed almost familiar. I traced the lines with my fingers, trying to decipher their meaning, but my mind was too foggy, too drained to make sense of it. But then, as I stood there, the memory of Lillian's voice came back to me, clear and strong. "Don't give in." It was a warning, and I knew that whatever force had saved me, whatever had driven back the darkness, was connected to her somehow. The house, the mirror, the figure in the woods, it was all tied together, part of the same malevolent entity that had taken her from me. I couldn't leave now, not without understanding what had happened, not without finding a way to stop it. I had to go back to the house, back to where it all began. The thought filled me with dread, but I knew it was the only way. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to end this nightmare, I had to face the darkness head-on. With renewed determination, I left the clearing and began to make my way back through the forest. The path clearer now, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting as I moved. The house awaited me, a looming presence on the edge of my mind, and with each step I took, I could feel its pull, drawing me back into its grasp. But this time, I wasn't running from it. This time, I was ready to fight. The walk back to the house felt like a journey through a waking nightmare. Forest, though less menacing than before, still held an air of unease, as if it were watching me, waiting to see if I would falter. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches swaying like the arms of silent sentinels, and the path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, each step taking me closer to the place I dreaded most. But this time, I wasn't afraid. The encounter in the forest, brilliant flash of light that had driven back the darkness, had given me a newfound resolve. Whatever malevolent force had taken hold of the house, of my life, I was determined to confront it. I would no longer be its victim. As I reached the edge of the woods, the house came into view, looming against the darkening sky like a shadow made flesh. It looked the same as it always had, old, worn, with peeling paint and sagging eaves. Now it felt different. The malevolent presence that had once pervaded every corner seemed to have receded, as if the light from the clearing had banished it, at least temporarily. I hesitated at the front gate, my hand hovering over the rusted latch. This was it. I was standing at the threshold, on the brink of a confrontation that could either free me or destroy me. The house, with all its secrets and shadows, was waiting. With a deep breath, I pushed open the gate and walked up the path to the front door. Porch creaked under my weight, the boards groaning in protest, but I didn't stop. I had come too far to turn back now. The door swung open with a soft creak. I stepped inside, familiar scent of dust and decay greeting me like an old acquaintance. The house was silent, air heavy with a sense of anticipation. Closed the door behind me, sound echoing through the empty halls, and stood in the entryway, listening. Nothing. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, my footsteps the only sound in the oppressive silence. The living room was empty, furniture covered in a thin layer of dust, grandfather clock standing silent and still. The kitchen was much the same, a cold, lifeless space that seemed to belong to another time, another world. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, a familiar creak of each step filling the silence. My heart pounded in my chest. I forced myself to remain calm. I had to keep my wits about me. I had to stay focused if I was going to find the source of the darkness that had taken hold of this place. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something strange. The door to the bedroom, the one where I had first found the note, where I had seen the twisted reflection in the mirror, was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. My pulse quickened as I approached the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The room was just as I had left it, cold, empty, the bed neatly made, and the curtains drawn. In the center of the room, on the floor, was a large, circular stain, dark and wet, as if something had seeped up from the very foundation of the house. I knelt beside the stain, my fingers brushing against the damp surface. It was cold to the touch, and as I pulled my hand away, I noticed that the substance clung to my skin, thick and oily, like the residue of some ancient, festering wound. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. This was the heart of the darkness, the source of the malevolent presence that had taken hold of the house. It had been here all along, festering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I stood up, wiping my hand on my pants, and backed away from the stain. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The house, the darkness, it was all connected, all part of the same twisted, malignant force that had taken Lillian from me, that had been slowly driving me to the brink of madness. And now it was trying to pull me in, to consume me just as it had consumed her. I had to act quickly, had to find a way to banish the darkness before it was too late. But how? The light from the clearing had driven it back, but that was just a temporary reprieve. I needed something more, something stronger, to destroy it for good. I racked my brain, searching for some clue, some memory that might give me the answer. And then I remembered the stone in the clearing, carvings that had shifted and changed, revealing a pattern that seemed almost familiar. The symbols. They were the key. I was certain of it now. Whatever force had driven back the darkness in the clearing, it was connected to those symbols, to the ancient carvings that had been etched into the stone. If I could replicate those symbols, if I could somehow harness their power, I might be able to banish the darkness from the house for good. But I couldn't do it here, not in this room. I needed to go to the source, to the place where the darkness was strongest. The basement. My heart pounded as I made my way downstairs, the house growing colder, darker, each step I took. The basement door loomed ahead, portal to the heart of the darkness, and I hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open. The air that greeted me was frigid, the darkness thicker, more oppressive than ever. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, flashlight in my hand barely cutting through the gloom. The walls seemed to close in around me, the cold seeping into my bones as I made my way deeper into the bowels of the house. When I reached the bottom, I paused, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the room. The basement was just as I remembered it, damp, musty, filled with the remnants of lives long forgotten. But there, in the far corner, was the hidden room, the door slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out. I approached the door slowly, my heart in my throat, pushed it open. The room beyond was just as I had left it, the shelves lined with dusty books and strange objects, the photograph of Lillian and me still lying on the small round table. Now, the darkness was stronger, thicker, and I could feel its presence pressing in on me, trying to push me out. I forced myself to step inside, old biting at my skin, and knelt beside the table. The symbols, the carvings, I had to remember them. My mind raced as I tried to recall the pattern, the intricate lines that had been etched into the stone in the clearing. And then, as if guided by some unseen hand, I began to draw. I traced the symbols on the floor, using the oil from the stain on my hands as ink. The lines came easily, the pattern unfolding in my mind, each stroke of my hand bringing me closer to completion. The darkness pressing in, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I was finished, I stood back, breathing heavily, and looked at what I had created. The symbols glowed faintly in the darkness, a soft, pulsating light that seemed to push back the shadows, if only slightly. I could feel the darkness recoiling, retreating, but it wasn't enough. I needed something more, something to ignite the symbols, to activate their power. And then it came to me. Fire. I fumbled for the lighter in my pocket, my hands shaking as I flicked it open. The small flame sputtered to life, casting a warm, flickering glow that seemed almost out of place in the cold, oppressive darkness of the room. I knelt down, holding the flame to the edge of the symbols, and watched as the oil caught fire. Flames spreading rapidly, racing along the lines I had drawn. The symbols blazed with a brilliant light, the flames consuming the darkness, driving it back. The room grew brighter, warmer, as the fire spread, the symbols glowing with an intensity that made me shield my eye. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, fire went out. The room was plunged back into darkness, but this time it was different. The oppressive weight was gone, the air no longer cold, the malevolent presence that had haunted the house banished, at least for the moment. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, my body trembling with relief. It was over. The darkness had been driven back, the house purified by the light of the symbols. I had won, at least for now, but as I lay there, breathing heavily, couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The darkness might be gone, but it wasn't destroyed. It was still out there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to return. And when it did, I would be ready. The house felt different after the ritual. The oppressive weight that had suffocated me for so long was lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe freely, my thoughts no longer consumed by the darkness that had haunted every corner of my life. The silence was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace, a welcome reprieve from the chaos that had nearly driven me mad. But the peace was fragile, delicate, like the calm after a storm. I knew it wouldn't last. The darkness was gone, but not destroyed, and somewhere deep inside, I could feel it. Waiting, watching, biding its time. Days passed in a strange blur. I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, filling my time with small tasks around the house, attempting to reclaim a life that had been lost to the shadows. I fixed the creaking porch, cleaned the dust from the furniture, and even ventured into town a few times, trying to reconnect with the world outside the house. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was far from over. It was late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that I found myself in the attic again. The shattered remains of the mirror still lay where I had left them, glittering like shards of a broken nightmare. I had avoided the attic since the ritual, reluctant to confront the memories that lurked there. But something had drawn me back, some whisper of unfinished business that I couldn't ignore. I stood in the center of the room, staring down at the shattered glass, the dust swirling around my feet. The air was thick with the scent of age and decay, the remnants of lives long forgotten. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay, to confront whatever it was that had brought me here. As I stood there, a faint sound reached my ears, barely audible over the silence. It was a rustling, like the pages of an old book being turned. or the whisper of a breeze through dry leaves. I turned, scanning the room, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The attic was as it had always been, dark, dusty, and empty. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until I could no longer ignore it. It was coming from the far corner of the attic, where a stack of old crates and boxes had been piled haphazardly against the wall. I hesitated for a moment, the memory of the last time I had encountered something strange in this house still fresh in my mind, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved toward the crates, the sound growing louder with each step. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the stack and began to carefully move the boxes aside, each one sending up a cloud of dust that made me cough and blink. At the bottom of the pile, hidden beneath a thick layer of grime, I found an old wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate designs that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The chest was locked, but the lock was old and rusted, and it broke easily under the pressure of my hand. I lifted the lid, the hinges creaking, and stared down at the contents: old photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a journal, pages yellowed with age. I picked up the journal, the leather cover soft and worn, and carefully opened it. The writing inside was neat, precise, and instantly recognizable. It was Lillian's handwriting. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, the words blurring before my eyes. The journal was filled with entries, each one meticulously dated, chronicling a life I had thought I knew but now realized I had only glimpsed in passing. The entries began years before we had met, detailing her thoughts, her dreams, fears. But as I continued reading, the tone of the journal changed, becoming darker, more frantic, as if she had been struggling with something she couldn't quite put into words. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the final entry, dated just days before the accident that had taken her from me. The handwriting was shaky, the words scrawled hastily, as if she had been desperate to get them down before it was too late. I don't know how much longer I can fight this. The darkness is growing stronger, feeding on my fears, on my grief. It whispers to me in the night, telling me things I don't want to hear, showing me visions of things I can't bear to see. I've tried to push it away, tried to banish it, but it keeps coming back stronger each time. I'm afraid, Ethan. Afraid of what it's doing to me, of what it will do to you if it ever gets the chance. I thought I could protect you, keep you safe, but I'm not sure I can anymore. I can feel it closing in, taking over, and I don't know how to stop it. If you're reading this, if you found this journal, then it means I've failed. I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry. Please don't let it take you too. Don't let it win. The journal slipped from my hands, landing with a soft thud on the floor. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just read. The darkness hadn't started with me, it had started with her. It had taken root in her long before we met, growing stronger over time, feeding on her fears and her grief until it had consumed her completely. And now, it was coming for me. I stumbled back, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of fear and disbelief. Lillian had known, had tried to warn me, but I had been too blind, too consumed by my own grief to see the truth. The darkness that had taken her, that had haunted this house, wasn't just some malevolent force. It was a part of her, a part of us, and it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. As I stood there, gasping for breath, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a voice I knew all too well. Ethan? I turned, my heart pounding, and saw her standing in the doorway, her form pale and translucent like a ghostly apparition. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her once beautiful face was twisted into an expression of sorrow and regret. Lillian, I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond, didn't move. She just stood there watching me, her presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating dread. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very walls of the attic were closing in around us, wrapping me in a prison of my own making. The darkness was back, stronger than ever, and it had brought her with it. I took a step back, my mind racing, searching for a way out, a way to escape the nightmare that had taken hold of my life. But there was no escape, no running from the past, no hiding from the truth that had been buried for so long. Lillian began to move toward me, her steps slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine. The air grew colder with each step she took, the darkness swirling around her like a living thing, feeding on her presence, growing stronger, more powerful. I knew then that there was only one way to end this, only one way to banish the darkness for good. I had to confront it, to face it head-on, just as she had tried to do. But this time, I wouldn't be alone. I reached for the journal, my fingers brushing against the worn leather cover, and held it out to her. "This isn't you," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that gripped my heart. "This darkness, this thing, it's not who you are. You fought it, Lillian. You fought it with everything you had, and I'm going to do the same." She hesitated, her form flickering as if caught between two worlds. The darkness around her wavered, and for a brief moment I saw a glimpse of the woman I had loved, the woman who had been taken from me far too soon. But the darkness wasn't ready to let go. It surged forward, enveloping her, pulling her back into its cold, suffocating embrace. I could feel it reaching out for me too, trying to drag me down, consume me just as it had consumed her. But I didn't back down. I held my ground, the journal clutched tightly in my hands, and stared into the darkness, refusing to let it win. "This ends now," I said, my voice firm. "You're not going to take me, and you're not going to take her. I won't let you." The darkness roared in response, a low, guttural sound that shook the very walls of the attic. The air around me grew colder, the shadows closing in, but I didn't waver. I held the journal out, the pages fluttering in the wind, and took a step forward toward Lillian, toward the darkness that had taken her from me. And then, with a blinding flash of light, darkness shattered. The shadows dissolved, old receded, and the oppressive weight that had held me captive for so long lifted, leaving me standing in the attic alone. Lillian was gone. I dropped to my knees, the journal slipping from my hands as tears streamed down my face. The house was silent, the air still, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt at peace. The darkness was gone, banished by the light, and with it, the last remnants of the past that had haunted me for so long. But as I sat there, alone in the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Darkness might be gone. The scars it had left behind would never truly heal. They would linger, like shadows on the edge of my mind, a constant reminder of what I had lost, of what I had fought so hard to reclaim. And as I stood up, the journal still lying open on the floor, I knew that I would carry those scars with me for the rest of my life. But I would also carry something else. Hope. Hope that the light would always be there, even in the darkest of times. And that as long as I held on to that light, I would never truly be alone. Years passed, but the memories of the house on the edge of town never truly faded. They lingered at the back of my mind like a distant, half-forgotten dream, resurfacing in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, when the world was asleep and the mind had nowhere to hide. After that final confrontation in the attic, I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The darkness had been driven away, but the echoes of what had happened there were too strong, too deeply rooted in the walls, in the very foundation. So I sold the house, left the town, and tried to move on with my life. I moved to a different city, far from the shadows that had nearly consumed me, and built a new life. Wasn't easy. The scars of what I had experienced ran deep, and for a long time I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. But as the years went by, the memories began to dull, and the fear that had once gripped my heart loosened its hold. I found new purpose, new hope, in the small, everyday things: work, friends, the comfort of routine. Life moved forward, as it always does, and I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind me. Still, there were nights when the past would come creeping back, unbidden, in the form of nightmares that left me drenched in sweat, my heart racing with an all-too-familiar fear. I would wake in the dark, my breath catching in my throat, half expecting to see that twisted reflection staring back at me from the shadows. But the nightmares would always fade, and I would remind myself that it was over, that the darkness was gone. One evening, as I was sorting through some old boxes in the attic of my new home, I came across something that stopped me cold. Photograph. It was tucked between the pages of an old book, forgotten among the other remnants of my past. I hadn't seen it in years, and yet, The moment I laid eyes on it, the memories came flooding back. It was the photograph of Lillian and me on our wedding day, the same one I had found in the hidden room in the basement of the old house. We were smiling, her head resting on my shoulder, our eyes bright with the joy and promise of a life we never got to live. I held the photograph in my hands, tracing the edges with my fingers, and for a moment, felt as if no time had passed at all. The years fell away, and I was back in that house, back in the darkness, fighting to hold on to the woman I loved, fighting to survive. But there was something different about the photograph now, something that hadn't been there before. I looked closer, my heart skipping a beat as I noticed a faint shadow in the background, barely visible but unmistakable. It was the shape of a figure, tall and indistinct, standing just behind us. My breath caught in my throat, cold chill running down my spine. I turned the photograph over, half expecting to see some mark, some sign that it had been altered. The back was blank. The photograph was just as it had always been, and yet the shadow was there, a dark presence that hadn't been there before. The realization hit me like a blow. The darkness hadn't been banished. It had followed me, waited, biding its time, growing stronger in the shadows of my memory. And now, after all these years, it was reaching out once more, trying to reclaim what it had lost. I placed the photograph back in the book, my hands trembling, and closed the box. I couldn't stay here, couldn't let the darkness take hold of me again. I had to leave, to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of the shadow that had haunted me for so long. But as I made my way down the stairs, the photograph tucked away where it couldn't hurt me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The darkness was a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my life, my very soul. No matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. And as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt a familiar presence at my back. Cold breath on the nape of my neck, and I knew with a terrible certainty that the darkness wasn't finished with me yet. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing in the distance, watching me from the shadows. But the street was empty, the night still and quiet, with only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind to break the silence. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay here, couldn't let the past catch up to me. The darkness might be a part of me, but I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. I would keep running, keep fighting, until the very end. Because no matter how strong the shadows grew, no matter how deep the darkness reached, there was still a part of me that believed in the light, that held on to the hope that one day I would find a way to banish the darkness for good. And until that day came, I would keep moving, one step at a time, away from the shadows, away from the past,